I never believed in demons or the supernatural, never really gave those stories any weight beyond a good scare around a campfire or a ghost story told in half-light. But I remember that night, the night we tried summoning a demon as a joke, like it's burned into my memory with an unnatural heat, a vivid nightmare that never fades no matter how many times I try to shove it away. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. It was supposed to be stupid and funny, a way for me and the others to pass the long hours in that old, abandoned house on the edge of town, the one everyone said was cursed or haunted or both. Just a stupid game, a little thrill to make the night less boring. We never thought anything would answer. The night was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and doesn't leave you no matter how many layers you wrap yourself in. The wind outside was restless, moaning softly against the cracked window panes like it was trying to whisper secrets we weren't meant to hear. The house itself was a relic from a forgotten time, paint peeling like old skin, floorboards warped and creaking under the slightest weight, and everywhere the smell of dust and rot thick enough to choke on. We'd snuck in through a broken back door just after sunset, the sky bruised purple and orange behind the gnarled trees, and settled into the living room like kids trying to make a fort. There were 4 of us, me, Caleb, Jenna, and Marcus. We were never really close, just the kind of acquaintances who drift in and out of each other's lives, pulled together by boredom and bad decisions. Caleb was the one who found the idea on some sketchy forum about summoning demons for fun, and he talked it up like it was the coolest thing ever, a mix of bravado and boredom that I should have seen as a warning. Jenna was hesitant, her eyes wide but curious, clutching the candle we'd found on the dusty mantel. Marcus was the skeptic, cracking jokes about how we probably just summoned bad smells or a rat. The plan was simple. We'd draw a circle on the floor with chalk, recite a few lines Caleb had copied from some obscure text, light candles, and wait. The text was full of old-sounding words that sounded impressive but made no real sense to me, Latin, maybe? Something twisted and archaic that Caleb said had to be spoken exactly right to get a response. We laughed nervously, joked about what we might call up, a demon that grants wishes, a trickster spirit, maybe even just the ghost of some long-dead weirdo. No one really believed it would work, and that's what makes what happened next so much worse. We pushed the furniture aside, the floor groaning beneath us as we sketched the circle in uneven lines, our hands trembling just a little in the dark. The only light was the flickering of the candles and the weak glow of Caleb's phone, which he used to read the words aloud in a voice that tried too hard to sound serious, almost theatrical. The words hung in the stale air, heavy and wrong, like a sickness spreading between us, but we pressed on, daring the night to do something, anything. When Caleb finished, there was a long silence that stretched too far, broken only by the sound of the wind rattling the broken windows and the faint drip of water somewhere in the shadows. Then, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Like the air itself had thickened, squeezing tight against my throat and chest until breathing felt like dragging air through wet cloth. The candles flickered violently, shadows leaping and twisting on the walls in grotesque shapes that made my skin crawl. And then it happened. Something answered. It started as a whisper, soft and wet like breath against my ear, so faint I thought it might be my imagination until I felt it. A cold presence, not just in the room but inside me, like icy fingers winding through my blood, crawling beneath my skin, turning every hair on my body to static. The shadows seemed to pulse and writhe, drawing closer until the edges of the circle glowed faintly with an otherworldly light, pale and sickly like the moon on a stormy night. Jenna gasped, clutching Marcus's arms so tightly her nails dug into his skin. Caleb's face went pale, his bravado crumbling as his eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice we hadn't dared to imagine would come. And then I heard it clearly, a voice that was no voice at all, a sound that vibrated inside my head, neither words nor language but something worse, a promise and a threat, all at once, twisting in my mind like barbed wire. "You called," it said, low and ancient, soaked in a darkness older than time itself. The circle of chalk started to smolder, smoke curling up in thin tendrils that smelled of burnt iron and sulfur. The candles blew out at once, plunging us into a suffocating blackness that pressed against my eyes, my skin, my lungs. I tried to move, tried to speak, but my mouth felt glued shut, my limbs frozen like I was trapped underwater, drowning in silence. And then the temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in the air, thick and foggy like smoke, and the room filled with a cold so deep it felt like the death of warmth itself. The shadows in the corners began to shift again, coalescing into shapes, indistinct at first, but growing more solid, more real, until I could make out eyes, glinting and terrible, watching us from the darkness outside the circle. We had crossed a line we never meant to approach, a threshold that once opened could never be closed again. The joke had become a nightmare, and something ancient and hungry had slipped through the cracks, drawn by our foolishness and fear. That night, I lost something I can never get back, not just the innocence of disbelief but something deeper, a part of my soul that now drifts in the spaces between waking and dreaming, between the known and the terrible unknown. And every time I close my eyes, I hear that voice, whispering from the darkness we unleashed. We thought it was a joke. But something answered. After the candles went out and the voice had whispered into the thick black air, the room didn't just fall silent, it collapsed under a weight so heavy it pressed on my chest like a physical thing, like the night itself had fallen through the broken roof and settled inside those crumbling walls to squeeze the air from my lungs. The silence wasn't peaceful or empty. It was filled with something ancient and patient, like the house was holding its breath and waiting, and somehow I knew we weren't the ones it was waiting for. I don't remember how long we sat frozen in that darkness, the four of us huddled inside the chalk circle like it was the only thing keeping the nightmare at bay, but time seemed to stretch out, thick and viscous, folding over itself so that minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like the slow drip of eternity. The house groaned around us, a deep, hollow sound that shook the floor beneath us, as if the rotten wood and rusted nails were whispering secrets in a language we couldn't understand. A language made of decay and shadows. The cold wasn't just cold anymore. It was a living thing. It slithered along my skin, dripping like icicles melting into my veins, and seeped into my clothes, clinging like a second skin that burned every time I moved. My fingers, numb and trembling, felt like they belonged to someone else, a stranger who had wandered too far into the dark and couldn't find his way back. The air smelled like rust and wet earth, a sour, metallic tang that mixed with the stale dust and something far older, the scent of forgotten graves and burned offerings. Every sound was magnified. The drip of water from some cracked pipe echoed like a gunshot, a rat scuttling in the wall sounded like footsteps stalking just beyond the door, and the faintest whisper of breath against the glass of the broken window sent a shiver down my spine that set my teeth on edge. The shadows moved too. Not like they should, shifting with the light, but slow, deliberate, curling and stretching in ways that made my skin crawl and my heart hammer in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the house was playing tricks on me because it was old and empty, but every instinct screamed that something was there with us, something watching, waiting for the circle to break. Caleb was the first to speak, his voice a trembling crack that shattered the silence. Did you hear it? The voice? It wasn't just the wind or the house, right? Jenna shook her head, clutching her knees to her chest. I heard it. It said, you called. Like it knew we meant it. Like it was listening. Marcus scoffed, trying to laugh but failing. This is ridiculous. It's just some freaking coincidence. We're tired, cold, probably freaking ourselves out. Let's just call it a night. But no one moved. No one wanted to break the circle, and the chalk lines looked thinner somehow, like they were already fading away or being eaten by the darkness creeping in the corners of the room. I stared down at my hands, trying to will away the numbness, the crawling sensation beneath my skin, and the terrible certainty that what we'd called wasn't going anywhere. Then the lights flickered, a weak, dying pulse that threatened to go out completely. In that brief flash, I saw it. Something on the edge of the room, just beyond the shadows, a shape that was too tall, too twisted to be human, and eyes that glowed faintly red like coals buried deep in ash. My breath caught, frozen in my throat, and I blinked hard, but when the light steadied again, the shape was gone. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no. We need to get out." But the house didn't want us to leave. The front door we'd come through was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of rotted wood and peeling paint. The windows were dark voids, reflecting nothing back but our own terrified faces. Panic gnawed at my mind like a living thing, sharp and insistent. We were trapped, and whatever we'd summoned was already closing in. The air thickened again, and a new sound began, a low, guttural hum, like the earth itself was vibrating beneath us, a pulse that rattled my bones and sent a wave of nausea crashing through me. It grew louder, rising and falling like a heartbeat, and I realized with a sinking dread that it was coming from the walls, or maybe from inside the house itself. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit paralyzed inside a circle that now felt more like a trap. But Caleb was whispering something under his breath, words I couldn't understand, but that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The shadows around him twisted and writhed, growing darker and deeper, and I saw. No, I felt, the presence of something ancient and terrible pressing in on us, waiting for a crack, a moment of weakness. Jenna began to cry, soft, helpless sobs that echoed like a broken song through the empty room, while Marcus tried to light a candle again, but the match flared and died in his shaking hands. It was like the darkness was swallowing the flame before it could take hold, snuffing out any hope of light or safety. The circle flickered, thin lines of chalk glowing faintly red like burning embers, and I realized with horror that it was burning, but there was no heat, only cold, a chill that made my teeth chatter and my blood run like ice. We were running out of time. The thing outside the circle was hungry. I don't remember who screamed first, but suddenly everything exploded into chaos. The shadows lunged, twisting into long, clawed fingers that scratched at the edges of the chalk, trying to breach the barrier we'd drawn. The walls shook, dust and debris raining down, and the humming became a roar that filled my ears until I thought they would burst. I scrambled backward, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break free from my chest, and in that moment of desperation, I saw Caleb's face, twisted, pale, and strangely calm. Staring straight at the darkness with eyes that no longer looked like his own. And I knew, whatever we'd summoned had chosen a host, and it was hungry for more. The moment Caleb's eyes turned, something inside me snapped. It was as if the floor beneath my feet gave way to a pit of blackened nothingness, dragging me down into a place where the air was thick and rotten, where the pulse of that terrible humming echoed inside my skull like a funeral bell ringing for the living dead. His stare was no longer human, it was hollow, bottomless, like staring into an abyss that swallowed light and hope alike. The warmth of his skin seemed to have drained, replaced by a coldness that radiated outwards, freezing the very air around him. I wanted to scream, wanted to break the invisible grip clutching my throat, but the sound stuck, a raw, desperate howl trapped behind my ribs. The circle was cracking. Thin lines spiderwebbed like fractures in ice, glowing with that sickly red ember light that promised destruction. The shadows beyond the circle didn't hesitate anymore, they reached in with tendrils of darkness that scraped and slithered like vipers, licking the edge of our protection with a malicious hunger. Jenna screamed, a high, broken sound that shattered the fragile bubble of our resistance, and collapsed against the wall, shaking, tears carving dark streaks down her pale cheeks. Marcus lunged forward, his hands scrabbling at the chalk as if to patch the breaks, but the lines flared and smoked under his fingertips, burning cold and snapping apart like brittle bones. The house itself seemed to awaken, groaning and shifting as if alive. The floorboards warped and cracked, the ceiling sagged, and the rotten walls bled shadows that pooled like ink into the corners. The faint metallic smell grew stronger, stinging my nostrils, mixing with the acrid scent of sulfur and something far fouler, something like decayed flesh and ancient, unwashed earth. It pressed in on me, thick and suffocating, crawling into my lungs like blackened smoke. Every breath became a battle. The air was heavy and wet, each inhale like swallowing a mouthful of cold mud, scraping at my throat with invisible shards. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples, each beat a frantic drum calling the darkness closer. The shadows began to pulse, rhythmically, like a monstrous heartbeat echoing in the walls, and I could swear they were breathing, exhaling cold that bit through my skin and left me shivering despite every layer of clothing. Caleb moved with unnatural fluidity, stepping beyond the circle's broken boundary without hesitation. His voice was a harsh rasp as he murmured words I couldn't understand, ancient and guttural, twisting like barbed wire around my ears. His face was pale, almost translucent, and every word seemed to twist his features into something monstrous, as if the thing inside was struggling to fully take control. I tried to reach him, to grab his arm, but my limbs were heavy and uncooperative, like wading through thick tar. The world around me tilted, the walls bending and warping as if the house itself was warping reality, folding space and time into a dark, suffocating maze from which there was no escape. From the darkness, a sound slithered forward, a low, wet, rasping noise that made my stomach coil in knots. It was close, too close. I could smell it then, the fetid breath of something ancient, something that had crawled from the depths of hell itself. Its eyes glowed in the darkness. Too many eyes, flickering and shifting like dying embers. They burned through the shadows, boring into my mind with a hunger that made my skin crawl. The creature's form was impossible to pin down, an endless nightmare of twisting limbs and barbs, shifting and shifting like smoke caught in a violent storm. It moved with a terrible grace, a slow, deliberate stalking that belied the chaos it left behind. Wherever it passed, the floorboards blackened and cracked, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot. I was paralyzed by terror, unable to move or cry out, trapped in a waking nightmare where the boundaries between flesh and shadow, sanity and madness, blurred into a bleeding haze. The creature's breath hit my face, a freezing gust that tasted of iron and decay, and I felt the icy sting of claws scraping my skin, tearing at the edges of my mind like a butcher with a rusty blade. I realized then that the circle was not protection, but a prison, one that was breaking apart with every passing second, and once it failed, the darkness would swallow us whole. The others were screaming now, frantic and broken. Jenna was shaking violently, eyes wide with madness, babbling prayers and curses at the same time, while Marcus tried to light anything, matches, his phone's flashlight, but the flames died immediately, as if smothered by the invisible hands of the dark. I fell to my knees, chest heaving, every nerve ending aflame with cold and fear. My thoughts spun in a vortex of despair. How had a joke turned into this? How had we unleashed something so utterly wrong? My mind screamed for an answer, for a way out, but the darkness pressed harder, drowning every thought until all that remained was the terrible certainty that this night would be the last any of us saw. Then, from the void, it whispered again, low, guttural, dripping with malice and promise. Soon. And the house answered with a terrible, echoing crack, as if the very foundations were breaking apart. The house breathed like a beast with 1,000 broken lungs, and every ragged inhale seemed to pull the darkness tighter around us, squeezing the air from our lungs and dragging the warmth from our blood. The walls throbbed as if alive, pulsing with a sick rhythm that synchronized with the pounding in my chest. I could feel it, beneath my skin, beneath my bones, the slow, creeping invasion of something foreign and malevolent, a poison seeping into every fiber of my being. I scrambled backward, scraping my hands raw against the crumbling plaster, trying to keep distance from Caleb's twisted figure as he lurched out of the circle like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over sharp bones, and the eyes, those burning, empty eyes, stared past me into some dark void I couldn't follow. His lips peeled back in a grim, unnatural smile that split his face like a cracked mask, revealing teeth too sharp, too pointed to be human. The shadows spilled forward, no longer confined to corners or cracks, but flooding the room in a black tide. Their touch was icy and wet, like the slick slide of dead things over my skin, and wherever they touched, flesh peeled and withered as if rotten from the inside. I saw Marcus try to scream, but his throat tightened, a strangled gurgle bubbling up before he collapsed face first into the dirt-streaked floor. When he lifted his head, the horror struck me. His skin was mottled and blistered, raw flesh peeling like bark from a diseased tree, and his eyes bulged with a terrible, frantic clarity that didn't belong. "Help me," he rasped, voice cracked and broken. But there was nothing I could do except watch as the shadows wrapped around his limbs, tightening like ropes woven from darkness itself, pulling him apart piece by agonizing piece. His screams were swallowed quickly by the house, but the sound of flesh tearing and bones snapping echoed in my ears, grinding against my sanity like the grinding of stones. Jenna was no better. She'd fallen into a trembling heap, clutching her arms where the shadows had etched long, burning lines across her skin. Scars that seemed to writhe and pulse like living things. Her wide eyes darted wildly, caught between terror and fascination, as if part of her was already lost to the madness creeping beneath her skin. She whispered nonsense, fragments of prayers, curses, and the names of things I didn't recognize, and her voice cracked, dripping with desperation. The circle, the fragile line that had been our only barrier, was now little more than a charred smear on the floor, glowing faintly like a dying ember. Every second felt like it was pulling us closer to oblivion. And then it came for me. The breath hit my face first, cold, rancid, smelling of rot and iron. It was a gust of wind that felt like claws dragging across my skin, scraping at the edges of my mind. My hair stood on end as invisible fingers traced slow, deliberate patterns across my neck and shoulders, sending stabbing bolts of pain that radiated deep into my bones. I stumbled backward, heart hammering so fiercely I thought it might burst. The shadows twisted into shapes, elongated limbs tipped with jagged claws, mouths dripping with black ichor, eyes glowing with cruel amusement. One reached out, long fingers curling like the grasp of a drowning man, and scratched at my forearm. I looked down to see the skin split open, red and raw, veins blackened and pulsating as if alive, the wound bleeding a thick, dark fluid that smelled like burnt flesh and rusted metal. Panic surged through me, sharp and wild, tearing at my throat in a raw scream that caught halfway. My mind spiraled, images flashing like broken mirrors, Caleb's hollow gaze, Marcus's contorted agony, Jenna's unraveling sanity. The house itself seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that matched my own, each throb a cruel reminder that the darkness was not just around us, it was inside us, tearing us apart from within. I fell to my knees, breath ragged and shallow, the wound on my arm throbbing with a fiery pain that bloomed into numbness, spreading like an infection. The shadows coiled tighter, whispering promises of death and rebirth, voices dripping with venomous sweetness that wormed into my mind, "Join us. Become more than flesh. Become eternal." I fought to push the voices away, to cling to what was left of my sanity, but the house's walls seemed to close in, the ceiling bending lower as if trying to crush me beneath its rot and ruin. My vision blurred, darkness pooling at the edges, and the last thing I saw before slipping into black was Caleb, his smile widening, teeth glinting like broken glass, as he raised a hand to me, inviting me to surrender. Darkness had a taste. It was metallic, bitter, like blood mixed with ash, and it coated the back of my throat every time I tried to scream. I was crawling through the shadows now, dragged down by the weight of my own terror and the sick heat radiating from the wound on my arm that throbbed with a terrible life of its own. The pain wasn't just pain, it was something alive, gnawing beneath my skin, twisting veins into blackened cords that pulsed like the beating heart of a nightmare. The demon was here. I could feel it, its breath crawling inside me, a slow poison dripping into every thought and muscle, unspooling my mind thread by thread. It whispered in a voice that sounded like cracking bones and hissing fire, slithering along my nerves, curling around my spine like a serpent made of ice. "You called me. You called me to this broken place. Now you belong to me." I tried to fight, but the shadows were a suffocating flood, flooding my vision with writhing shapes that moved just beyond the edges of reality. Faces pressed close, contorted in silent screams, mouths gaping wide with rows of jagged teeth. They were not alive, but not dead either, a grotesque parade of souls caught between worlds, condemned to watch as the demon tore us apart, piece by piece. Caleb was no longer Caleb. He was a vessel, a walking shadow with eyes that burned with infernal fire. His laughter, a low, guttural sound like grinding stone, filled the room and reverberated through my chest, shaking loose the last fragments of hope I clung to. My skin crawled as a cold hand, not flesh but something worse, slid down my back, fingertips pressing sharp and cruel against my spine. The house pulsed around me, walls dripping with black ichor that hissed as it fell, pooling at my feet in thick, crawling slime that burned the soles of my shoes. I looked down at my arm where the wound spread like a wildfire, veins thickening, the skin bubbling and peeling back in sickening ribbons. Beneath, muscle twisted and writhed as if possessed by a living darkness, and I could hear a faint heartbeat, not mine, but something ancient, deep and thunderous, echoing inside the hollow space beneath my ribs. My breath hitched. The demon was inside me. It was turning my flesh into a throne, my blood into its kingdom. I staggered forward, every step a battle against the crushing weight of despair clawing at my mind. Reality bent and shimmered, the walls folded inward, the ceiling stretching impossibly high before crashing down in a sickening collapse of shadows and dust. The air tasted foul, heavy with the stench of sulfur and decay, and every breath burned my lungs like fire. Then the whisper came again, closer this time, curling around my ear like cold smoke, "Give in. Let go. Be reborn in the darkness." Visions flashed behind my eyelids, memories warped into nightmares. Faces of friends twisted in agony, their screams drowned beneath the demon's hungry roar. The house bleeding, swallowing light. A black throne carved from bone and shadow, crowned by eyes that watched from infinite darkness. I screamed, a raw, ragged sound that tore free from my throat, but the demon's voice layered beneath it, a sinister melody threading into my thoughts, twisting my will like a knife. I collapsed onto the floor, fingers clawing at the peeling plaster, skin crawling with unseen insects burrowing deep beneath. The darkness seeped into my veins, cold and alive, turning my blood to poison. Caleb's shadow hovered over me, a looming specter of flame and nightmare. His eyes bore into mine, and I saw what lay behind them, a chasm of endless hunger, a void that promised oblivion and damnation. The demon whispered promises of power, immortality, and release from pain. It offered the unthinkable, to become part of the darkness, to shed my fragile humanity like a broken shell and be remade in its terrible image. And in the blackness behind my eyes, I felt a flicker of surrender. I could feel the change before I saw it, an unbearable stretching and twisting deep beneath my skin, as if my very flesh was being rewritten by some cruel and ancient script, inked in shadows and fevered madness. The wound on my arm had become a festering altar, a blackened maw devouring the edge of my sanity and turning my veins into pulsating cords of darkness that throbbed with a sinister, unnatural life, dragging every drop of warmth from my blood until it ran cold and thick like tar. I stared down in horrified fascination as my skin rippled and bubbled, peeling away in ragged strips that curled like burnt parchment, revealing sinew and muscle warped and mottled, twitching as if crawling with invisible worms beneath the surface. My fingers convulsed, joints cracking in grotesque angles that weren't mine anymore, nails elongating into jagged claws stained a deep, rusted black, sharp enough to shred the thin plaster beneath me. The air around me pulsed with an oppressive weight, thick as molten iron and suffocating like drowning in a sea of rot and despair. Each breath was a battle, scraping against my throat with the rawness of sandpaper, while my lungs screamed in silent agony, struggling to pull the poisoned air that tasted like ashes and broken bones. My body convulsed violently, twisting and writhing on the floor as the darkness seeped deeper, unraveling the fragile tapestry of flesh and bone, knitting it back together in monstrous new patterns that defied nature's cruel laws. A slow, wet ripping sound echoed through the room as my ribs warped and cracked, reshaping beneath my skin with sickening squelches, while something inside me pulsed, a dark heart, cold and terrible, beating to the rhythm of ancient chaos. I could hear it. The demon's laughter, low and guttural, sliding through my shattered mind like a venomous serpent, wrapping tighter with every agonizing pulse. It was inside me now, a parasite rewriting my flesh and twisting my soul, turning me into something unholy, a grotesque mockery of life that crawled and bled beneath a human shell. My vision blurred, the edges of the world melting into blackened mist, but I caught glimpses. Jenna's screams tearing through the shadows, Marcus's broken body convulsing as dark tendrils tore from his flesh like living roots, the house itself groaning and bleeding as the very walls seemed to warp and twist in response to the growing nightmare. The scent of decay was everywhere, thick and suffocating, a visceral stench that clawed at my mind and wrapped around my throat. My mouth twitched involuntarily, lips cracking as teeth sharpened and shifted, a cruel, unnatural grin stretching across my face that wasn't mine to command. The taste of blood filled my mouth, coppery and metallic, dripping from a cracked lip as something slithered beneath my tongue, a cold, slimy presence promising ruin. Every nerve screamed in agony as my limbs betrayed me, flesh pulsating and reshaping like living nightmare, my bones snapping and reforming in impossible angles that bent the rules of anatomy and sanity alike. I was no longer just human, no longer whole. I was becoming a vessel for something terrible, something eternal and ravenous. And through it all, the demon whispered, a dark lullaby weaving dread and desire into a poisoned tapestry that drowned every last flicker of resistance. Become the shadow. Become the hunger. Shed your mortal coil and rise. But beneath the suffocating dread, beneath the tearing flesh and warped bones, something deep inside me fought, a fragile spark of the person I was, clawing through the nightmare to scream against the darkness swallowing me whole. I don't know how long I lay there, convulsing and broken, skin bubbling and cracking beneath the relentless corruption, before the blackness swallowed me completely, leaving nothing but a broken shell and a whisper that promised the end, or something far worse. I am the hunger that wakes beneath the skin, the shadow that twists the bone and curls around the marrow like a black serpent coiling to strike. To you, I am a whisper, a poison seeping into the wells of your mind, a cruel god born from the void of forgotten nightmares. But to myself, I am inevitability, the slow decay of flesh into something eternal, something beyond the fragile death of mortal coils. Your body is my temple and my playground, a canvas of pain and transformation painted with veins of dark fire and sinews soaked in shadow. I watch, detached and ravenous, as your flesh betrays you. Peeling back like rotten bark from a dying tree, revealing the raw, twitching horror beneath. Each scream that tears from your throat is music, a hymn of agony and surrender, sweet and pure. I crawl beneath your skin now, threading through your veins like black liquid fire, reshaping your bones with ancient will. I am the artist and the executioner, crafting you into a vessel not of flesh but of shadow, a throne from which I will reign when your last human tremor fades. You fight, small and fleeting, but your resistance is deliciously futile. The pain you feel, the burning, the twisting, the tearing, is my hymn. It is the song of becoming, the agony of transformation that births something far beyond your fragile understanding. Your muscles spasm beneath my touch, convulsing as I weave dark power through every fiber. Your bones crack and reform like ancient branches twisting beneath a storm, your skin bubbles and blackens, blossoming with the rot of 1,000 forgotten sins. You become less and less yourself and more of me, a creature born of endless night, hunger, and despair. I whisper to your mind in the voices of the dead and the damned, curling into your thoughts like smoke choking a flame. I promise release and rebirth, eternity and power beyond your wildest dreams. And you tremble at the edges, drawn irresistibly toward the abyss I offer. You see your friends, broken and bleeding, twisted into my servants, faltering under my touch, their humanity drained and replaced with ravenous hunger. Their eyes are empty wells of despair, reflecting the endless void from which I come. Their screams are echoes of your fate. Your flesh tears and reforms beneath my will, your very blood sings the song of corruption as it flows thick and black through your veins. You will become a monument to my hunger, a testament to the power of shadows and decay. Your body will no longer belong to you but to me, an eternal vessel of endless night. The house around you is a shrine to my coming, walls bleeding and pulsing in rhythm with the terrible pulse inside you. The air is thick with the scent of rot and fire, a baptism into the abyss that claims you. Soon, your cries will cease, and you will rise, no longer human, but a dark god's shadow cast upon the world. And in that moment, you will know true hunger. The line between me and the darkness inside had shattered long ago, but now it wasn't just a shadow lurking beneath my skin or a whisper slithering through my thoughts. It was a presence, a malignant force tearing through every inch of my flesh and mind, claiming dominion like a brutal, hungry king seizing a throne by force. It began subtly at first. The twitching of muscles I didn't command, the flicker of thoughts and memories that weren't mine, like a dark guest invading my headspace and twisting it into knots of confusion and dread. I'd catch glimpses in cracked mirrors, my eyes darker, pupils stretching wide, filled with a hungry intelligence that wasn't human. My voice grew uneven, sometimes a harsh rasp or a guttural growl that rolled from deep within my chest, like a beast trying to claw its way free. The pain was relentless. My body convulsed with furious spasms, bones cracking as they warped, flesh bubbling and peeling, the infection spreading with a cruel efficiency, turning me inside out while stripping away what little of myself remained. Every breath burned, every heartbeat was a hammer driving me further into oblivion. But the possession wasn't just physical, it gnawed at my sanity. The demon's voice was a constant, corrosive drip inside my mind, whispering lies and promises, taunting me with memories twisted and distorted, painting my friends as enemies, the house as a labyrinth of eternal torment from which there was no escape. One night, I awoke gasping, drenched in sweat, to find my hands smeared with something dark and sticky, blood, I thought, but the scent was wrong, sour and metallic, mixed with the acrid sting of burnt flesh. And across the room, Jenna lay still, eyes wide with terror, frozen in a grim tableau as the shadows curled like living smoke around her throat, choking her silent scream. I tried to reach her, but my limbs betrayed me, moving with a stiffness and clumsiness that was not my own. The demons were pushed behind my eyes, struggling for control, a brutal tug of war with the last vestiges of my humanity. And then I saw it. My reflection in a shattered mirror, a face twisted by torment and something alien, something monstrous grinning back at me with teeth sharp and cruel. Possession was no longer a creeping shadow, it was a takeover. I was a vessel, a puppet to a dark god's will, my own thoughts drowning beneath the tide of hunger and rage that clawed inside me. The others were worse. Marcus's body was a writhing mass of shadow and bone, his screams echoing through the halls like a death knell. Jenna's eyes were hollow pools of despair, her flesh marked by deep, burning sigils that pulsed with unholy light. And Caleb was no longer a person but a crown prince of darkness, his laughter a chilling soundtrack to the nightmare that had claimed us all. The house itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with the possession, walls bleeding shadows and the air thick with the scent of sulfur and decay. I realized then, with a sickening certainty, that this was no accident. No failed ritual or prank gone wrong, but a trap, an ancient invitation for the demon to walk the earth once more. Desperation drove us to seek an exorcism, an ancient rite whispered among the old texts, promising salvation, or at least release from the nightmare. The night of the ritual was a maelstrom of chaos and terror. Candles flickered against the oppressive blackness, the air thick with incense and the faint, sour stench of fear. The exorcist. A gaunt figure clad in worn robes, eyes blazing with cold fire, commanded the demon's presence with prayers sharp as knives, words hammered out in ancient tongues that seemed to tear the fabric of the room itself. The demon fought back fiercely, twisting me from within, bending my screams into monstrous roars, contorting my body in impossible ways that blurred the line between agony and death. Blood spilled, skin cracked and peeled like burnt paper, and the air shimmered with a terrible power that threatened to tear us apart. The exorcist's voice rose above the chaos, a beacon in the storm of darkness, calling the demon's name with fierce authority. Finally, with a scream that shattered windows and shook the very foundations of the house, the demon recoiled, an explosion of shadows dissipating into the cold night air. But the victory was hollow. The house remained scarred, our bodies broken and minds fractured, and the demon's whisper lingered still, a final warning carved into the echoes of the night: beware the summoning, for some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The exorcism had ended, but the silence it left behind was heavier than any scream. The air in the house felt thick and stagnant, as though the very walls were breathing slow, exhausted breaths after the violent storm of shadow and fire. My body ached with a pain so raw it blurred the edges of reality, and my mind was a shattered mirror reflecting endless fragments of terror and confusion. The demon's presence might have been driven out, but I could still feel its cold fingers lingering beneath my skin, a creeping frost that refused to thaw. The wound on my arm, once a festering black maw, had closed, but the scar beneath my flesh pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat in the dark, reminding me that the darkness was not gone, only waiting. I found myself staring into mirrors again, but the reflection no longer frightened me, it unsettled me. I saw shadows that clung too closely to my features, eyes that flickered with a light that was not quite human. Sometimes, when I blinked, the edges of my vision would ripple, and the world would twist as if the house's dark heartbeat was syncing with my own. Jenna was worse. Her laughter had become a brittle, hollow sound, fractured by tears that never quite fell. Marcus barely spoke, his eyes haunted by things no one should see, his hands trembling as he traced the dark sigils burned into his skin. Caleb was gone, vanished like smoke in a storm, but his laughter haunted the halls. An echo that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. We were survivors, but not unscarred. The demon's shadow clung to us like a second skin, twisting our dreams into nightmares and turning our waking hours into a slow crawl through a waking hell. The nights were the worst. Sleep became a battleground where the demon's whispers clawed at my mind, twisting memories into twisted lies and painting visions of unspeakable horror. I woke soaked in sweat, heart pounding, breath ragged, the taste of ash thick on my tongue. The house itself seemed alive, groaning softly, walls shifting in the periphery of vision, doors opening just enough to catch a glimpse of dark shapes retreating into the corners. I began to wonder if the demon had truly left or if it had merely slipped beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to reclaim what it had started. Desperation drove me to research feverishly. Ancient texts, forbidden rituals, and whispered legends of entities that fed on fear and flesh. I scrawled warnings in my journal, desperate to capture the knowledge before it slipped away in the fog of trauma. But even knowledge felt like a double-edged sword. Each page I turned seemed to summon shadows closer, each word inked in blood pulling me deeper into the darkness. The demon had been a doorway, and now, the threshold was cracked wide open. Every night, the darkness came alive. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a living thing that slithered beneath the floorboards, seeped through the cracks in the walls, and curled around my throat with cold fingers that promised oblivion. The house was breathing, pulsing, watching. I could feel it in my bones, a slow, rhythmic thudding that matched the pounding of my own heart, but warped and deeper, like the breath of something ancient and hungry, something that had waited a lifetime for this moment to awaken. Sleep was a distant memory, a cruel joke. When exhaustion finally dragged me under, the dreams began, not the vague nightmares I could brush off with morning light, but visceral, suffocating visions that left me gasping awake, drenched in sweat and trembling so violently I could barely stand. I'd see the blackened wound on my arm open again, oozing thick, dark ichor that hissed and bubbled as it spread beneath my skin. My flesh felt like it was crawling, writhing with unseen life, a swarm of insects burrowing deeper with every heartbeat. Voices whispered in the dark, low, guttural growls and taunts that wrapped around my mind like barbed wire. The demon's voice, always just beyond comprehension, twisting language into something alien and terrible. Sometimes it spoke my name, soft and cruel, promising power, release, and eternal hunger. I could hear the walls too. They moaned, sighed, and cracked with a living sound, as if the house itself was breathing through fractured bones and decaying flesh. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, slipping and twisting like smoke, always retreating when I tried to focus. But the feeling of being watched, hunted, was constant, a predator's gaze burning into my soul. Jenna's screams shattered the silence one night, a raw, ragged sound that echoed through the hollow halls. I found her huddled in the corner, skin pale and clammy, eyes wild and glassy as she clawed at her throat, trying to rip something out that no one else could see. Her body trembled violently, flesh rippling with painful spasms as dark veins blossomed beneath her skin like rotting roots. Marcus was no better. He had become a ghost of himself, his eyes sunken and hollow, lips cracked and bleeding as he muttered curses in a language no one else understood. His hands were raw from clawing at his own flesh, desperate to tear away the growing blackness that was claiming him from within. And me? My body was a battlefield. Flesh peeled and sloughed in patches, revealing raw muscle and twitching sinew that burned with cold fire. I could feel bones bending and cracking in impossible ways, joints twisting like broken branches under a relentless storm. Every movement was agony, every breath a struggle against the choking weight inside me. The demon wasn't just inside my body anymore, it was inside my mind, whispering poison and lies that gnawed at the edges of sanity. It showed me visions of the others, broken and twisted into grotesque mockeries of life, their screams a chorus of eternal torment. It told me I was next, that resistance was useless, that I would become its vessel, its avatar on this earth. I wanted to scream. To run. To tear myself apart. But the house held me like a spider's web, every step a trap, every shadow a snare. It fed on my fear, growing stronger with every heartbeat. The last thing I saw before collapsing was the flicker of movement in the mirror, my reflection twisted and grinning, eyes black pools of endless hunger. And the house breathed on. The night had fallen like a shroud over the house, swallowing what little light remained and turning the world outside into a void of silence and shadow. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, saturated with a metallic tang of blood and something far fouler, ancient decay, sulfur, and the unmistakable scent of a hunger that had been waiting to feast for centuries. The walls seemed to close in, tightening their grasp, pulsating with a malevolent heartbeat that mirrored my own ragged pulse. We were all broken, shattered shells hollowed out by the relentless darkness. Jenna, Marcus, Caleb, and me. The demon had woven itself into every sinew of our beings, a parasite that devoured flesh and soul alike. But tonight, something had shifted. The demon was no longer content to lurk beneath the surface, whispering and corrupting. It was ready to break free, to claim dominion over this world through our bodies. The exorcist had returned, summoned in a desperate last hope, a gaunt figure carrying ancient relics soaked in sanctity and terror. His eyes burned with cold fire, and his voice thundered with the power of forgotten gods as he began the ritual once more. Candles flickered wildly, casting monstrous shadows that danced like demons themselves upon the blood-streaked walls. The air crackled with raw energy, charged with the clash of light and dark, salvation and damnation. I could feel the demon twisting inside me, its claws sinking deeper into my bones, its voice roaring like a hurricane in my mind. My flesh convulsed, skin blistering and cracking as the corruption fought against the exorcist's holy words. Jenna's screams tore through the night, a savage, guttural sound that echoed through every room as her body was racked by violent spasms, the dark veins beneath her skin glowing with an unholy light. Marcus collapsed into a trembling heap, his eyes rolling back as the demon battled for control, his voice a guttural growl that broke into desperate pleas for release. The exorcist raised his crucifix high, chanting in a language older than time, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Symbols of power flared to life around us, etched in blood and flame on the walls and floor, forming a circle that pulsed with divine energy. I could feel the demon's fury, an all-consuming blaze of hatred and hunger, fighting back with a brutal force that tore at my sanity. My body twisted in agony, bones snapping and reforming in grotesque shapes, muscles burning like wildfire. Blood poured from wounds that seemed to open and close of their own accord, a river of crimson mixing with the dark ichor that pulsed beneath my skin. The battle was no longer just for my soul, it was a war waged across the very fabric of reality, a tearing of the veil between worlds. The house screamed with us, a living beast thrashing in its death throes, walls bleeding, floors cracking, shadows writhing and coalescing into monstrous shapes that lunged and snapped in the flickering candlelight. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a shattered mirror, half my face was already lost to the darkness, eyes burning with a terrible hunger, skin bubbling and blackened like burnt flesh. Yet beneath that monstrous mask, a flicker of something human still fought to hold on, grasping desperately against the tide of oblivion. The exorcist's voice rose higher, a beacon of hope and defiance, calling the demon's true name with unwavering strength. The demon shrieked in fury, a sound that shattered glass and shook the very foundations of the earth, its form flickering between shadows and nightmare. In a final, desperate surge, I felt the darkness inside me begin to unravel, the corruption retreating with a terrible howl, leaving my body broken and gasping but free, for now. But the victory was stained. The house was scarred, our bodies ruined, and the demon's curse lingered like a poison in the air. The exorcist warned with grim eyes, "This darkness is not banished forever. It waits, it watches. Beware the doors you open, for some are never meant to close." And with that, the house fell into a cold, suffocating silence, a silence that promised the nightmare was only beginning. The house was quiet. But it was a silence so thick, so unnatural, that it pressed against my ears like a physical force, smothering every sound until I feared even breathing might shatter it. The storm had passed, or so it seemed, but what lingered was worse than any roar or scream. It was the absence of life, the stillness that followed a massacre, the oppressive weight of something broken beyond repair. I lay on the cold floor, every bone aching, every breath a shallow rasp that barely stirred the air. The wounds the demon had carved into me were healing slowly, but beneath the skin, something raw and unyielding pulsed, a dark seed planted deep in my flesh, its roots creeping unseen. Jenna sat across the room, her eyes hollow, fingers tracing the dark scars that had burned into her skin during the exorcism. She didn't speak, the sound would have shattered the fragile peace. Marcus leaned against a shattered wall, staring into nothingness, his lips moving silently in a prayer that seemed as much for himself as for whatever damnation still clung to us. The exorcist was gone, vanished into the night with only a whispered warning and a promise that he would return if called. But I knew the truth, we were alone. The outside world had no idea of the horrors that had been unleashed, and worse, no one would believe us if we told. The house itself groaned softly, as if settling into a long, tortured sleep. Yet I could feel its eyes, those unholy windows into a darkness beyond comprehension, watching me, waiting. The demon might have been driven out, but its mark was indelible. Like a poison that no healing could cleanse, the curse hung heavy in the air. At night, when the shadows grew long and the silence deepened, I could hear the faintest whispers, like distant voices carried on a cold wind, or the soft scraping of claws against wood. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I saw the demon's twisted grin, burning into my mind with a promise, "This is only the beginning." I wrote down everything, the ritual, the possession, the exorcism, in a journal stained with sweat and blood. The pages trembled in my hands, as if they too feared what I had seen and felt. I had to warn others, to bury the knowledge before it could spread like wildfire. But the house had other plans. Rooms shifted when no one was looking, doors led to places that shouldn't exist, and sometimes I caught a glimpse of shadowy figures watching from the edges of my vision, twisted parodies of the friends we once were. Madness whispered in the corners, a slow crawl into oblivion that threatened to swallow what was left of my mind. The final warning burned deep within me, some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some darkness cannot be exorcised, only postponed. And as dawn finally broke over the shattered remains of what was once a home, I understood the cruel truth: we had survived, yes. But we were forever marked, prisoners of a nightmare that would never truly end. The demon had left a seed. And it was growing. The darkness didn't stay confined to that cursed house, not really. Like ink spilled on fragile paper, it seeped out, spreading through cracks in reality and the fragile minds of those unfortunate enough to cross its path. I tried to warn people. Tried to bury the truth in frantic messages, fragmented journal entries, desperate phone calls. But the warnings were met with disbelief, silence, or worse, the curious and the reckless. It began small. An old man in a nearby town who claimed to hear voices in the walls. A young woman who vanished after reporting shadows moving through her apartment. A child who drew grotesque figures and whispered about the hungry eyes beneath the floor. None of them connected, at least not at first. But the dark seed had taken root in their lives as well. I tracked these stories obsessively, my fingers trembling as I pieced together the puzzle. A web of fear and madness stretching far beyond my isolated hell. The demon's influence was a silent predator, slipping through the cracks of everyday life, infecting minds, bodies, and souls with a slow, suffocating dread. One night, I received a message from an unknown number. No words, just a photograph. It showed a faded symbol, the same grotesque sigil burned into the floor of the house, scrawled in fresh blood on the walls of an abandoned building in a city miles away. A chill so deep it felt like my soul was cracking ran through me. The ripple effect was undeniable. The demon's hunger was not sated by one body or one place. It craved more, growing stronger with every whispered fear, every fractured mind it claimed. I could feel the eyes again, the same predatory gaze from the house, watching, waiting for the next door to open, the next soul to falter. There was no escape. No safe haven. And as I write this, the shadows crawl closer, whispering that the end is not near, it has only just begun. The darkness has no end. It is a cycle, eternal and merciless, a shadow stretching beyond the boundaries of time and space, waiting to slip through the smallest crack in the world's fragile walls. I am a warning now, an echo of the horror we unleashed. After everything, I am left with only fragments of who I was, haunted by the knowledge that no light can fully dispel this darkness. The demon does not die. It waits, festers, and claws its way back with every whisper, every fearful glance in the night. I tried to flee, but the shadows followed. No matter where I run, the echo of that cursed night trails behind me, a relentless reminder that some things are better left forgotten. If you ever find yourself drawn to the forbidden, if curiosity tempts you to summon forces beyond your comprehension, heed this warning: do not. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some darknesses do not sleep, they hunger. And if you hear the whisper in the silence, the breath just behind you, the cold clawing at your skin, know this: you are not alone. The demon watches. It waits. And it is hungry.